have any semblance to reality?
Rolling.
Hi, I'm Henry Coleman, and today is May 22nd.
Let's start again, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Henry Coleman, and today is May 22nd, 2008, and Jenny Matz and I are here to interview Douglas S. Cramer, who has a major background in television, and we'll get to that right away.
Okay.
Well, Doug, it's so great to have you here.
Thank you, Henry.
Because you are a major part of television history. And we'd like to take about 10 minutes to get some information about your early years and influences. For example, what was your name at birth?
Douglas Schofield Cramer, Jr.
And that was what year?
Well, actually, the year I turned 50, Aaron Spelling was my partner, and he had me come to his office. And he said, Doug, I'm going to give you a great birthday present. And I said, oh, what? He said, well, Warren Cowan, the publicist who just passed away, came in at that point. And he said, well, Warren's done something very important for your life and your career. We've just gotten removed from Who's Who in America and the television directory any mention of the year you were born in. And I said, what? Why would you do that? And he said, because you've turned 50, and in television, you're an old man now. And you don't ever want to discuss when you were born.
Well, we won't discuss then.
But let's say it was 1931.
All right, very good. Where were you born?
In Louisville, Kentucky.
And where did you grow up?
Well, I was in Louisville till I was 6 or 7, and then we moved way north to Cincinnati, Ohio, which was about 100 miles away, but in all truth, it was 1,000 miles away, because one was the deep south and one was the north.
What was your father's name?
Same as mine, but senior, Douglas Schofield Cramer, and he was, I say, he was Willie Loman, in that he went through his life on a smile and a shoe shine, selling involved in one thing or the other. He actually invented two very useful things. Neither one did he manage to have patent, so other people made the money. But the idea of the folding bridge table was his, and also he had a friend who owned a aluminum company and didn't know what to do with a lot of the leftover sheets of aluminum, so he came up with the idea of tinsel for Christmas trees. And which for many years, Reynolds Metals were the major makers of that. But Dad just sold tools and dies and ran factories and was always being bailed out by my mother, who was the creative, artistic one.
Well, tell us a little bit about your mother.
Well,
did she work at all?
Mother worked early on. She was a Louisville debutante who never knew how to cook or run a house, but she managed to set up in Louisville because she was not married by the age of 25, because she really wanted a career of her own. And she started a home decorating department in the biggest department store in Louisville. And all of her life, she was constantly redecorating our homes. About every 2 years, we'd buy a new house, and she'd fix it up and sell it just about the time the latest of my dad's businesses went kaploof. And she came out of that with a column of her own. She was in some 400 newspapers. I had a mother and a wife who were columnists, but Polly Pointers is what they were called. And she used to appear on the Mike Douglas show once a month, pointing out her latest pointers, which were things to help housewives, as if you make sandwiches and wrap them in tinfoil, lots of tinfoil things in the family, but if you would iron them in the morning when you're doing the ironing and give them the kids to take to school, they were warm and toasted at lunchtime. That was one of her big pointers. Another one was saving your stockings and making sweaters out of them. ghastly looking sweaters, but she used to make them. We were supposed to wear them. But she was a wonderful woman, and she really opened my eyes, as did her mother, who ran an antique shop. And they opened my eyes to looking at what was around me, which I think had a lot of impact on me as a producer.
What, do you think you inherited that from your mom?
I think that certainly got the awareness of what was going on, an interest in decorators, and I've used through my years, both on sets and in my private homes, lots of the best interior designers. Also, I think moving every few years gave me a fetish about property and maybe led into my collecting art. At one point I think I had 6 houses, and just to make me feel grounded. And I know all that it didn't take much analysis to help me understand how that came out of my childhood. My father died in his early 50s of a heart attack, and actually my brothers and myself are the only ones in our family, the only men on either side that ever got past age 54. It took me a bypass and some stents and being saved in a terrible situation in Paris from a clot after flying too long to make it, but I'm still here.
Did you have some children in your marriage?
I did. There were 2 children, a boy and a girl. The son was Douglas S. Cramer III, and he's still somewhere out there. We're estranged because we sort of have different thoughts about life and what he should be doing with it, and he didn't want my advice and took off one day in his car, and he's somewhere in America. He really would like to run a studio, motion picture studio, but didn't want to work his way up. And my daughter was a gifted writer and a child who most of her life battled with eating disorders and alcohol, and they finally got the best of her. It was a great, great loss.
And what was her name, Doug?
Courtney.
Courtney.
Right. She passed away about 4 years ago.
Tell us what you did about getting your career set up when you were younger. In other words, what do you want to be when you grew up?
I decided when I was 6, and I was given a subscription to Variety, that this was a fascinating world, and I wanted to be in show business. The only link that I had with it, because I was then in Louisville, and I think I had measles, and I had a half-sister from my father's first marriage. His ex-wife had married a Hollywood producer who ran Paramount Pictures in Hollywood briefly and then in London. And great irony, many, many years later, I had his office on the Paramount lot.
What was his name?
But David E. Rose. And David, when he moved David, when he moved to London to run the studio there, had my sister come every 6 months with him. So she spent 6 months of her life with us and 6 months there. And she went on to a fabulous career working for Vogue and as a model. And she was engaged to Billy Wilder and Peter Lawford and the Argentinian ambassador to Great Britain, but finally came back to Cincinnati and married a Procter & Gamble man and spent her life there raising 2 children. And it was rather ironic that it was the same course that I followed in my life. From 6, I couldn't wait to get out of Louisville and to New York, and by 9, we were in Cincinnati, and the goal was the same, to get to New York. I had a wonderful aunt and uncle that lived there who had no children, and I was kind of their adopted child. It was Charlotte and Fred Drexler. And they lived in a townhouse on 70th Street, about 2 blocks away from where I live now, with a lot of her furniture. I would come and visit them, and I must have been 12 before I realized that everybody in New York didn't live in a townhouse and had a man in a car outside with the driver waiting to take you wherever you wanted to go. But I got acclimated to the real life, and she took me a lot to the ballet and opera and galleries and museums and the theater. And it was wonderful a couple of times a year to know there was somewhere to go and someone to watch over me. And she was really my Annie Mame. So my life was focused in high school on learning as much about theater as I could, about art. I was in a lot of the school plays. I always ended up, I'd never be Romeo, but I'd be Mercutio, Horatio rather than Hamlet, but I was there. And I also wrote some of the school musicals and directed them and produced them. So by the time I got out of high school, I was really impossible. But I was determined to get, into the theater. I wanted to go to Princeton. My father told me we couldn't afford it, and I ended up at Northwestern. And I was really not wild about. They worked on getting rid of I had a really strong Southern accent, and I managed to lose a lot of that and now I think I sort of have an Ohio twang on some words. But I got acclimated to the world. I got closer to New York. And after 6 months there, Dad had another business fail. I was told I could go back to the University of Cincinnati. And I said, no, I'm going to New York. So I went off in a Greyhound bus and stayed at my aunt and uncle's and interviewed all over town. I was, an 18-year-old with 6 months at Northwestern and having done a lot of theater in high school. And I really, it didn't mean a thing. But fortunately, my father had gone to school in Kansas City, where he had grown up, with a man named Gus Eisel, who then ran Radio City Music Hall. So he gave me a job at Radio City as a production assistant. And I worked there for about 8 or 10 months. Really, in those days, Radio City had a movie which changed every 2 to 8 weeks, and a stage show. And a lot of stage shows had been done by Vincent Minnelli, who, the 6 Degrees of Separation, Vincent and Denise became the closest friends of Joyce, my wife, and myself when I lived in Hollywood. But then Vincent had moved on, and I had to find his old shows in storage up in Harlem and pull them out, and they just kept reviving one show after the other at the music hall. And somewhere along the way, a war came up. Would have been Korea in the 50s?
Yes.
Yeah. And they started drafting, and I decided I'd rather be at the University of Cincinnati than fighting in Korea. So I went back to school, enrolled at Cincinnati, met a wonderful man in the theater department there named Paul Rutledge, and ended up, although I majored in English, I also had a couple of plays I wrote produced by the school, directed, acted, and Paul had a summer theater in Culver, Indiana, and he opened a branch of it that I ran in, of all places, it was called Wawasee, Indiana. But we'd open shows in one theater with 200 seats and moved to the other, and we had a resident company, and for 2 years I ran that and learned a lot about theater and theater management. I graduated. My mother was terrified that I'd be like my father and even worse in show business and even worse in New York. So she insisted that I get a master's degree. I went to Columbia, got an MFA in a year, had a fabulous experience with John Gaster, who was a wonderful teacher of playwriting. He found me an agent, who was Phyllis Anderson, who was Robert Anderson, who wrote Tea and Sympathy's wife. And she managed, while I was still working on my graduate degree, and the year after that, to have a couple of my plays done in stock, and one called Call of Duty with Turam Bey opened off Broadway and ran at the old Provincetown Playhouse for 6 months. And a critic in the Post in those days was foolish enough to say I might be the next Eugene O'Neill. Little did he know he was off base. But I realized from doing all that that I really hadn't lived enough to have anything to write about. I'd written a play. That first play, Call of Duty, was about someone who was a prisoner in a prisoner of war camp. And I'd never even been in the Army at that point. Later, I was drafted for 6 months in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Never handled a gun, but learned to be very handy with a typewriter, which was good. So I came out of that. Cincinnati had opened a professional theater in a tent with 1,200 seats. Some local people had done it. It was a disaster. No one was going to it. They booked the wrong shows. And the critic from the paper in Cincinnati remembered that I had been very active in school, at the university, and in the little theater, and he recommended me. And at 20, I guess, I took over the Cincinnati Summer Playhouse, a professional theater. And the first thing I did was to book in a lot of shows that I'd wanted to see on Broadway, but hadn't been able to get to New York to see. Lois Smith and the Young and the Beautiful, Maureen Stapleton and 27 Wagon Loads, Ava Gabor, who was not yet a television star, but just one of the sisters. She did A Blithe Spirit. We packed the theater. There were enough theater people in Cincinnati that it was a great success. And I made enough money on it to, actually then, I should say, at the same time, during the winter, I started teaching at Carnegie Tech, the old Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon. And I taught playwriting and English to classes of freshman girls that had never read a book, but they wanted to be engineers. So I got them to read novels. I got them to come to New York to the theater. And it was really a wonderful life, but there was something driving me to be a playwright. I'd saved the money. I rented a house in Ibiza for the winter, which was very cheap in those days. I think it was about $22 a month for a waterfront house in the winter. And I headed to London, where I'd been once before, spent a month going to the theater, and was headed for Ibiza to write the great American play. And I got a call my father had died while cutting the grass. So I went home immediately, was there with my mother, and she was relentless in telling me that I didn't want the life of a writer, and I needed to do something that would make money.
Had she seen your play?
She'd seen the plays. Yes, she had. And she realized that the play ran 6 months, and I think I made $100 out of it. But she also knew that I had a certain feel for what people wanted to see. And so I went back to New York and stayed with my aunt and uncle and interviewed at all 3 networks and for any kind of entry-level position. And during that time, I also interviewed in David Merrick's and several Broadway offices, the Theater Guild. Couldn't get anything in the theater. It was all about connections, which I didn't have enough connections. Television was just beginning. My father didn't believe in television and wouldn't buy a television set. In the early days, I used to bicycle down the hill on the nights of Milton Berle and then some other shows so I could see them. And I was really not very knowledgeable about television until I got back to New York. I love the theater. Every opening night I was in the second balcony when I was in New York. And I read Burns Mantle, I still read Variety, and I talked theater. But the theater was not really a major going enterprise, and something called television was kind of beginning to work. And what I realized in talking to the network, somebody very astute at NBC said to me that television was really in those days controlled by the advertisers. And they knew more about what was going on than anywhere else. And he suggested that I should think about looking at General Foods or General Mills or General Motors or Procter & Gamble. Well, my ears went up at Procter & Gamble, first in horror going back to Cincinnati, but the fact that I knew people there And that sister, that half-sister, had just married someone high up at P&G. Well, I was going home for Christmas. I spent some time with them talking about P&G. I realized that P&G controlled almost all of daytime television because they owned serials that had moved from radio there. And they were getting deeply into nighttime. They sponsored the Academy Awards, which I thought sounded wonderful, a way of getting to Hollywood. I'd had one brief summer before I ran the summer theater where I went to Hollywood and got a job at MGM and worked in the script department at MGM, running pages to the set.
How did that come about, that job?
I somehow met Dory Sherry in New York at a party or something and impressed him, and he gave me his card and I wrote him, and when I got to Hollywood, I never saw him, but he gave me the job at $55 a week, I think. And so I was in Los Angeles, and Gene Kelly was starring. The irony, when I left my wife, Gene Kelly moved in as I moved out. So it's 7 degrees of separation. But it was a fascinating experience because it was Comden and Green and Singing in the Rain, excuse me. Singing in the Rain is one of the great movies, I think, ever. And I learned a lot about the movie business. But anyway, jumping back to Procter & Gamble, I went home to Cincinnati. Christmas, I learned that P&G was interesting. Those were the days you had to take tests to see if you qualified and you were part of the Procter & Gamble look or the General Foods look or whatever. So I spent the weekend at my sister's watching my brother-in-law. I went to P&G on Monday. I took the test, and I gave every answer the way I thought he would have given it. He was an East Coaster who had gone to Harvard, and to Dartmouth Business School and then Harvard. And so I answered the way Pete Link, my brother-in-law, would have, and I got the highest score anybody had ever gotten in the test, and I got hired. So I went to work for P&G, and within 3 or 4 months, my schedule was a week in New York, a week in Cincinnati, and every 6th week in LA. So that was not bad. And I learned an enormous amount about television, mainly about the television serial, which as a writer fascinated me. And that's where really the bulk of P&G's activity was. And that focused me on that Procter & Gamble to a network to Hollywood was what I needed to do.
Did that come before Radio City Music Hall?
Yeah, no, it was all after.
After.
It was Radio City Music Hall when I was 19.
What were your
back to UC.
What were your duties there?
At Procter &
At the music hall.
Oh, at the music hall, I said it was just, we've done all that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're way down.
Sorry.
Okay.
All right.
What was the position that you were initially hired for at P&G?
At P&G, I was hired as a daytime supervisor, and I was given As the World Turns and The Guiding Light. And they were both so-called Erna Phillips shows. Now, if anybody doesn't know who Erna Phillips was, and there are a lot of people that don't, she was the queen of daytime. She started on the radio.
As a writer.
About 4 shows as a writer. She realized the wealth available from a daytime show. And in no time at all, I think she had 4 daytime serials that she produced with P&G. She wrote half of them and trained other people. Most prominent were Bill Bell and his wife. And of course, Bill's children today still are multimillionaires from The Young and the Restless. And Bill was coming and sitting by her bedside. She spent most of the day in bed. She was in those days we'd say a spinster, but she had 2 adopted children under slightly mysterious circumstances. And she lived in Chicago because she didn't want to lose touch with the heart of America. And P&G, which was in Cincinnati, loved that. And she wrote these long breakdowns for the serials in the morning, and then 1 or 2 of them she would do in the afternoon. And she became all the characters, and she would dictate switching from character to character, and somebody would just write down everything she said, and there'd be a finished script, and it was sent off, and it was televised. It was remarkable. And I got to try doing some writing for her during a strike. I liked it, but I knew that it wasn't for me. And by then, I had a sense of what it was like to get it into nighttime. And we were then seeing not only Milton Berle, but Dinah Shore and Ed Sullivan and Lucy and Wally Cox and Mr. Peepers and all the David Susskind, the early shows. So television was really coming to life. And I spent 3 years in Cincinnati, once again trying to get out of P&G. And actually I met people at NBC, interviewed there, and was hired to take over daytime, which was a fabulous job. And I accepted it, went back to Cincinnati to say goodbye, and I got a call from the head of NBC that afternoon saying, "I'm sorry, but we have to withdraw the job." And we did it without P&G's permission. And they are one of our biggest sponsors, and we're sorry. So I spent another year at P&G, and then with 4 other people, we all left at once, having gotten jobs at advertising agencies in New York that did not handle P&G. And I went to work for Lever Brothers and General Foods, who were big suppliers, had their own shows, and they had competitive brands with P&G. No one at P&G was allowed to speak to me for a year, including my brother-in-law, who bent the rules a little on holidays. But we were all traders. And meanwhile, I was at Ogilvy and Mather in the great days of David Ogilvy. I was in New York. Our first apartment, the 5 of us took a floor through at a building that was going down at 277 Park, where we had, I think, 4 bedrooms and a fireplace in every room and parking space for the car for $300 a month. And it was incredible, and not long after, there was a house in Southampton. And I felt I'd arrived, and I loved it. But my goal was to get out of the advertising agency into a network. And I met someone named Ed Blyer, who still does something in the business. I think he sells time. Ed was head of sales at ABC. And he said, "You've got to come to ABC." It was then the struggling network. It was distinctly in 3rd place. They had Surfside 6 and a Y&I and a lot of things from Warner Brothers.
Did they have any of the Irma Phillips shows on daytime?
No, they were all on NBC.
Okay.
ABC had virtually nothing to do with P&G, except for the Academy Awards. And anyway, Eddie set it up beautifully at ABC, and he introduced me to Ed Sherrick, who was head of sales, and he introduced me to Daniel Melnick, who was head of programming. And Danny was smart as a whip and very sophisticated. He was married to Richard Rodgers' daughter and was an entree to Broadway, and he was fascinated by art, and he was everything I wanted to be when I grew up, although I think he was a year younger than I was. But at the same time, Ed Sherrick was smart as a whip and wanted to get into programming. And Danny, within 48 hours, Danny offered me a job as being something in development. And Edgar offered me a job to be in sales and a liaison to the programming department. But he said, "You know what?" He said, "If Danny's offered you a job," he said, "take it, because in 6 months I'm going to kill him, and then I'll have you knowing the department and what it is." So I did. I went to work for Danny. I maneuvered between the two of them for about a year, but Danny taught me so much, and he was absolutely extraordinary. And actually the first show in development that I had a hand in, Danny had loved Peyton Place. the movie and what it was. And I had, in high school, gotten suspended from the Pleasant Ridge Public Library for taking the book out, claiming that I was 16 and reading it. So I was very attached to Peyton Place. I found a script of Peyton Place on his desk. It was an hour, very serious drama. And I had been trying in the first 6 months at ABC to develop a daytime serial for nighttime. I actually tried to get Erna interested, Erna Phillips, in doing it, and P&G said no. And I tried to buy Coronation Street, which they wouldn't sell it to us, the great English hit. So I looked at Peyton Place and I said, let's make a nighttime serial out of this and put it on 5 times a week. Well, Leonard Goldenson, who ran ABC, and everybody in any kind of importance of a job got a call from Leonard every Monday saying, what's new? That was just the opening. The call would say, it's Mr. Goldenson on the line. He'd say, hello, Douglas, what's new? And you had to tell him. You instinctively told him everything. I told him this was an idea I was trying to sell. He said, it's brilliant. He said, I'll tell him to do it this afternoon. So at lunch with Tom Moore and Danny and everybody, he said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to develop it. But Danny wanted I wanted to bring Erna in to do it. Danny said no, and he said, we need somebody nighttime. There was a very hot young Hollywood writer named Paul Monash, who had done, I think, The Untouchables. And Danny thought Paul was absolutely brilliant and set him to do it. And it would have been great, except Paul didn't want to do a serial. So we had some months of rocky development with my pushing to make the show a serial and Danny and Paul pushing it to make a nighttime distinguished drama about a small town girl whose mother was no better than a hooker, raising her, a single mother. Anyway, Danny left to go into business with David Susskind. Edgar came in. Edgar understood exactly what I wanted to do. Edgar had wonderful taste on 2 or 3 levels, and he knew exactly what it was. We developed it. We shot a pilot. We're lucky enough to cast Mia Farrow and Ryan O'Neal and Barbara Parkins and Dorothy Malone. So there were new discoveries, and yet there was the prestige of Dorothy Malone and a couple of other people that were in it. And the network finally, at the last minute, chickened out at giving it 5 nights a week. And it went on the air just 2. But the development phase, getting scripts out and keeping the serial element, was a nightmare. Paul didn't want to do it. And I finally prevailed, and we hired Erna Phillips as a secret, uncredited advisor. And Erna took over the breakdown of the scripts and guiding the scripts, with Paul locking himself in one room, and other than going once to Chicago to meet with her, he just tried to undo everything she did. But Edgar was fascinated with her, and we listened to what she said, and within a year we were on 3 times a week. And the show was the first real nighttime serial hit. Erna later talked CBS into putting her version of a nighttime show on the air without the cloud of Hollywood and the elegance of the pre-sold title, and it was off the air in 6 weeks.
Can you mention that Peyton Place was a movie first, was it?
It was a great, great movie, yeah. Mm-hmm. It was an Academy Award-winning movie with, who was in it? Somebody will remember.
I don't remember.
It was a movie, I think, a good 8 or 10 years before. Lana Turner, I think.
Yes, I think so.
But it was a big success.
But let's talk about the people who were in the TV show that you helped.
Well, I talked about Mia and Ryan, and I mean, they were really the focus of the show, the younger focus, was Mia and Ryan and Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
And Mia, within the first year, had met Frank Sinatra, and not long after she married him, and that certainly helped the show because she was probably the best known. She had that early status, you know, of, you'd mentioned her not long after Jackie Kennedy, and she was the Princess Di of her days. And so the show went on and ran a long time, and later we, having had the success with that, I really wanted to do a cartoon strip, prime time, and we tried to buy Dick Tracy, and they wouldn't sell it to us. So then someone in, I think it was Yale Udolph, it was the man's name that comes from somewhere, had the idea of Batman, and I had been a big Batman fan and had a Batman costume and a friend that was Robin when I was 10 or 11. And so we got the rights. I went and met Crazy Bob Kane, who wrote it and created it, and the network bought the rights to Batman. Then, because we'd had success at Fox with Peyton Place, and there was a wonderful man running it, Bill Self, and Dick Zanuck gave Bill his head and an enormous amount of money to spend, which nobody else was spending in those days. And so Batman came into being at Fox. And there was a friend of Bill's who later became a very good friend of mine and kind of a mentor to a lot of my social and political and television life, man named William Dozier, who would run RKO and Screen Gems, been married to Joan Fontaine, whose apartment I bought many years later in New York when I retired. Again, life goes on and on. And Bill was the only man who ever had it in his deal that whenever he came to run a studio or to be there, he had to have a yard attached to his office and a dog door put in, and he was allowed to bring his poodle to work every day, who was in the office or in the yard. But anyway, we gave Bill Batman. He talked a great screenwriter named Lorenzo Semple into getting involved with it, who wrote the pilot. We went through a battle that Bill was convinced, and I was too, that we needed unknowns rather than recognized names to do it. And that's, after looking and reading lots of people, we came up with, found Adam West and Burt Ward. But because the network was, we're really leery it would be perceived as too much of a cartoon, we cast guest stars as the Riddler, and Julie Newmar was the Catwoman, and Frank Gorshin, I think, was the Joker or the Riddler. But there were lots of, Buzz Meredith was there. It became a thing to do. Butch Romero, Cesar Romero, was one of the regular heavies in the show. And so we built the names around it. When we shot the pilot, and it was the network, Edgar and Tom Moore, who was president, were really determined to overtake CBS or NBC. And we were on a roll with Peyton Place, and The Fugitive had gone on the air, and Ben Casey, which both Danny Melnick and Tom Moore had developed, and the network was beginning to fly. And there was a lot riding on Batman, particularly with 2 nights a week. We cut the pilot together and ran it for one of those days. Those days there was something called the ASI test. You would go to a place, Screen Gems owned it. I always wondered why their shows did better than anybody else's, but they would do the tests, and they'd get an audience from Farmers Market who would come sit with things attached to their fingers and tell you whether they liked it or not. Well, they wouldn't let us get a pure adult audience. We got both a kid and an adult audience and tested it, and it got the lowest rating from the audience that a show has ever gotten.
Why did they include kids, you know?
Because it was a 7:30 show, and they wanted kids to watch it, and they didn't want them to lose it. They didn't want to lose the kids in the audience. Well, this was on a Friday night, and we were on the air Wednesday of the following week. We went out to Scandi and had a great dinner and got drunk afterwards. And during the course of that conversation, we all decided that this was Edgar and Bill Self and Bill Dozier, and we really made the decision that what we were doing was plain safe, that we had to let the audience know what we were doing. So in 5 days' time, the picture was rescored. The pops and pals and all those visuals were rapidly made by Phil Norman, who was a great title maker. And we let the audience know they weren't to take it seriously. Show went on the air, it was a smash hit. And it was many years later until another show did as badly at the audience test, and that was a show of Aaron and Len's before I joined Aaron, called Charlie's Angels. And the initial audience hated it because they didn't know what those women were doing and didn't like women beating up on men and having all that authority. Anyway, Batman went on the air. It was a big hit. ABC was really geared, and I was geared on getting out of there and getting to Hollywood. And it was after all that success that ABC had, there were a lot of internal problems between Tom Moore, the president, and Ed Sherrick, who had been head of sales and was head of the net of programming, and really thought he should be the head of the network. And in reality, he would have been a terrific head. He totally understood the networking business. He had Goldenson and the board's blessing and approval. And we'd hired some remarkable people. He told me one day, because I was going to want to get out of there, and he said, "You never hire anybody strong enough when you're hiring somebody to work with you. I found somebody for you, and they're going to go to work for you next week as your assistant." And he said, "It's a measure of you as a man that you're going to like him and be able to work with him." Well, the person he introduced me to was Len Goldberg, who became a very good friend. And not too many years later, I was working for Len. But that's the way, as I say, the 6 degrees works. And then Lenny hired this kid from the Mars office to come in when we were doing a pilot with Marlo Thomas, and we needed somebody to handle her and keep everything straight. And the kid was Barry Diller. And about the same time, Marty Starger was hired and came in and joined us, all through Sherrick and the group of us there. And then this really brash kid from one of the networks, because nobody wanted to fool with daytime then, but he was willing to, Mike Eisner. Yeah. So everybody was there on West 66th Street in one little building. It was and Chuck Barris was running in and out of an office scheduling things before the Gong Show and that whole world. It was a remarkable place.
So you had some big hitters there.
We had some big hitters there, and Edgar and Tom faced each other down, and Edgar lost and quit, and he told me he'd quit, and he said, "I want you to come with me." And I said, "I don't want to come, Edgar, because I didn't think that either I nor Ed knew enough about making film, about the real mechanics of not being a network person, but making it yourself." And I said, "I want to go learn to make it." So Edgar went out on his own, managed in a short period of time to make 2 or 3 movies, to set up his own production company, to really do very well. I went to 20th Century Fox, where I had the great relationship with Bill Self. There was a guy that had been a salesman for one of the agencies we hired when Grant Tinker had been Bill's assistant, and he went off to open MTM. And we hired this brash guy from Brooklyn who never knew when to stop talking, but was the greatest salesman we ever saw, David Gerber. And David was doing sales, and I was doing program development, keeping an eye on the programming. And I moved to New Los Angeles,
And there
where
was-
within 3 months, Bill Dozier had introduced me to the woman I was going to marry. I loved being in LA then, and it was then what Santa Barbara is today. In the late 60s, LA was a small, really wonderful town. You could get around. There wasn't much smog. There were earthquakes, but I would be out of town. There were mudslides, but I didn't own a beach house yet. And actually, when Joyce and I were married and first moved into Beverly Hills, our second weekend was the Watts riots. And we were barricaded behind the doors, and the rioters drove by the house in Beverly Hills and fired at the front gate. But we survived.
So you were exposed to as much drama there in your life as you were doing in your work.
On television and using it wherever I could.
Mm-hmm.
So that was 20th Century Fox. I was there for 3 years. We developed lots of things with Irwin Allen, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, The Time Tunnel. We put with Hal Canner in an NBC deal, Julia with Diane Carroll, who I had met when she came to the house to dinner. I'd seen her in No Strings when she was Richard Rodgers' protege and knew her in New York. And then one Christmas, David Frost came to dinner Christmas night. We had a lot of the strays and people without families every Christmas. And David came, and his new girlfriend was Diane Carroll. And out of that was the bell rang, and a week later we were meeting with her and talked her into doing Julia.
Which was a big success.
Pilot worked, and in its day, it was a big success. So Hollywood was fascinating, and Zanuck was fighting to do what he could with the studio. Peyton Place was still on the air, struggling. Paul Monash kept trying to turn it into something other than a serial, but it worked year after year. And finally, I decided the time had come to do it on my own. Bill Self was not about to retire, still a young man. I wanted to do more. And my wife who was then a Hollywood gossip columnist, Joyce Haber, and wanted her husband not to be number 3 man somewhere. And I lived across the street from Bobby Evans back in the days with Ali McGraw, and they were our best friends. And Paramount had bought the old Lucy Desi studio, which had Mission Impossible and Star Trek on the air, losing a fortune. But they were part of the Paramount Gower lot. And I never quite knew what the exact steps were, whether Bobby had the idea first or my still good friend, who was then very friendly with Bobby Evans and had gone to ABC, Barry Diller. But Barry had his eye, even at that point, Barry always has his eye on the next 10 years. And he had his eye on Paramount. And somehow Barry and Bobby arranged that I met Charlie Bluhdorn. We hit it off, and I got hired to come in as executive vice president in charge of production. Paramount had nothing of its own on the air, and they had these 2 shows losing a lot of money. I did what I could to, make Star Trek more reasonable, and ended up in a 4-part series in TV Guide because I took on it also had Mannix, right, which was Bruce Geller's show. And Mannix was running more smoothly, and Mike Connors was more manageable, and it was a reasonable concept.
And wasn't Mission Impossible?
Mission Impossible lost hundreds of thousands every week. Bruce made it up as he went along. He was a brilliant television person, but he had no respect for the studio or a budget, and he thought that he controlled the 5 people that were the leads and that they would all quit if anyone got in his way. Well, we just forced his hand, and Barbara Bain was the first to go, and nobody missed her. And Marty Landau went on a sit-down strike, and we then brought in, because Barbara, no one had missed her, and we brought in Leonard Nimoy and the show continued to be a big hit. Made not the least bit of difference. And Bruce later came back and got involved with it again with the new team. But it was, for me, it was a real baptism of fire in dealing Paramount and dealing with Bruce and dealing with the networks who were really questioning. And I understand it, CBS was full of questions as to what I would do with their hit and how I was qualified to do this. I was still, I guess I just turned 30. No, I was 34 or 5 by then, I guess. But I grew a beard, so I looked a little older and a little more authoritative. And I was in David Rose's old office, which Bobby Evans had been in. Bobby had moved to, Bobby had the whole concept of, I'm going to leave the studio and all that overhead and work out of an office in Beverly Hills. Well, that was great, except Charlie owned all the studio, and he had all those sound stages, so he came to me and said, make it work. Well, that's when I got very active, and in a short period of time, we developed and put on the air Love American Style, which was an idea of mine to do some sort of an anthology of multi-stories. And that was the first show to go on the air.
That was an hour show.
It was an hour show which had 3 distinctly different stories about people in love, making love.
And did you have guest stars?
Push the edges. We had guest stars. And it was locked together by a framework of 8 or 10 comics, sort of, you know, that's me, forgive me. Can we stop for a second?
Yeah.